Welcome to this week's edition of the Wellbeing Show. Got a fantastic guest on this evening, Mark Gilman, who I'm going to introduce shortly, who I haven't seen in a couple of years. So I'm really excited to have you back, Mark. This is the 2nd of February at 9 o'clock UK winter time. And if you're listening to that, whatever the equivalent is around the world, it's live. We'd love to have you join in. We're streaming on Facebook Live on my Facebook page, Noel Mcdermott Mental Health Works Limited, and also on my company's YouTube page, which is just Noel Mcdermott. And it'd be great to have you join in, or if you wish, you can drop me a WhatsApp on +44 7506 319 745. Is that a sneeze coming? It feels like it. Get a sneeze right at the beginning of the show. Let's see if it comes or not. Anyway, enough of that. It'd be great to have you join in. I've got my phone here, so if you've got any questions, pop them in, and I'll pass them on to Mark. Enough of that. Hello, Mark. Welcome. Good to have you back.
Hi. Okay.
Yeah, good. Did you hear me? How are you?
Yeah, all good.
Good. It's been how long since I last saw you? I think about 4 years now or something, isn't it?
Maybe 4 years, yeah, I guess it will be that, yeah, probably. Yeah.
4 years before the pandemic.
Yes.
The pandemic itself. How have you been during the pandemic? Thankfully, we're coming out of it, but how has it been for you?
Not good, really. It's I didn't do very well, really, with it. The isolation of it. Yeah, I didn't. I mean, I don't think anybody. Well, I certainly couldn't prepare for it. Did as much as I could, and took a few measures to try and get as much social interaction as was legally and socially possible. And obviously took to Zoom very quickly, but no, a very unnatural dystopian experience, as everybody said. But
yeah, I remember having that really strange trauma response of right at the beginning of it all of experiencing things like it was a film as opposed to
absolutely,
and that sort of almost disassociation going on from the experience. It was very, very strange at the beginning. That shutdown stuff was really bizarre.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I didn't. I know some people took to it like a duck to water. They were happy, but I'm quite, pathologically social. So
nothing
it didn't suit me.
Social, quite the opposite, to be honest.
Yeah,
it's pathological being isolated, as you well know. Your background is in crime reduction, addiction, treatment services, etc., but very much from a policy background. You've been involved in the National Treatment Agency and Public Health England, which is now the UK, whatever, health security, UK HSA or whatever it is now. And so that's your background. How did you get into that? It'd be interesting to know about you, Mark, and your story and how you got into those. Because in the end, and then you moved on to the private sector and set up your own consultancy. And so we'll come to that bit of it. But how did this northern lad, Mark, end up being what was at the time the most senior civil servant in addiction services in the UK for a while?
So I'm from Bury, which is in North Manchester, or South Lancashire if you're trying to impress a prospective mother-in-law. Relatively born into a newspaper shop, newsagents, classic kind of row shops on a predominantly blue collar working class area. So paper shop on the corner, that's where I was born. Butchers next door, grocers and chippy, fish and chip shop. So born in the sweet shop, only child to Jenny and Reg, the kid in the sweet shop. So only child in a sweet shop. So very popular, as you can imagine.
I can imagine you were.
Yeah. Plenty of blackjack.
Drug dealing early, it seems.
Yeah. So Yeah, very popular with the sweet shop. School went very well. And then the first experience of trauma was my father actually had a brain hemorrhage in front of me when I was 12. 11th of February 1969, and literally everything changed almost literally overnight. So from being, I'm not sure that I were ever a straight A kind of student as a child, but certainly, doing okay, supported at home, parents were pro-education, etc., etc. But then when my dad died, I took a turn to the dark side, I never really came. But I didn't know that then. Stuff that we know now about trauma and ACEs and adverse childhood experiences. But I'd certainly racked up a full raft of adverse childhood experiences by the age of 13.
Yeah. Well, tell us, for those that don't know, what an ACE is, because it's an evidence-based approach to understand.
Yeah, so ACE is adverse childhood experiences. And they range from, so in my case, witnessing the death of a parent, which is quite a significant, serious, adverse childhood experience. And if on a continuum, although it's debatable whether it is a continuum, but something might be witnessing your parents arguing constantly and raised voices, etc., etc., which some might say, well, that's all. Everybody does that in our family, but for others, that might be an adverse childhood experience. Yeah. So they're all the things you would imagine. So death of a parent, a mental health problem of a parent or a caregiver, divorce, particularly nasty divorce, unpleasant divorce, violence, substance misuse disorders amongst parents and peers and loved ones and family, etc. So that they're adverse childhood experiences.
Sort of assessment tool, aren't they, in terms of potential risk factors, but also maybe understanding why somebody who is an adult sitting in front of you has the problems that they have. You can often then trace it back to these things and make sense of sort of how they try to make sense of those experiences. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. So then
behind it as well is, I think that's the point that's important to me. Unlike, say, some of the psychoanalytic stuff about early caregiver interactions and then extrapolating disastrous outcomes from that. There is evidence that backs up ACE research that the
absolutely
outcomes, if you have, it's very simply put, I think my understanding is this, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but the higher your ACE score, the more severe the outcomes for you later on in life, unless we do something in between to reduce that. Is that right?
Absolutely. That's correct. Yeah. So the higher the score, the bleaker the prognosis. And the higher the score, the more urgent the need for intervention.
So it's a really useful way of indicating when somebody's at risk, and we might need to think about putting resources into dealing with that risk before they're in prison, before they're in a psych ward, in their 30s or 40s.
Absolutely. So for me, without turning it into it's all about me, because I wasn't allowed to grieve my father's death, in those days you weren't allowed to, I wasn't allowed to go to the funeral. It wasn't talked about much. And then surprise, surprise, as an adult, you go on to develop issues of abandonment.
Makes a lot of sense because you don't get the closure.
Yeah.
You get to do that social grieving. A lot of people will identify with that from this period of time. I don't want to open up the conversation about Partygate because it's intimately now linked to people not being able to go to funerals. But we said at the time that this inability during the pandemic to socially grieve was going to damage people.
Absolutely.
And that's what you're talking about. You weren't given the capacity to re-engage in meaningful relationships with people.
No.
Through that social grieving process.
Yeah. And so basically I then went off into the wilderness for I left school at 16, did all manner of things, went on the hippie trail, did the usual India, Thailand, Nepal, Kathmandu, etc., and then got dysentery. And thank God for dysentery, because that meant that I had to stop travelling, go and sort the amoebic dysentery, as it was. And whilst attending the School for Tropical Medicine in Liverpool to have the amoebic dysentery treated, I met a guy who's, because a long story short, said to me, "Why don't you go to university?" And he assures me that I then replied with a statement which I said, "People like me don't go to university. We go to prison or to mental hospitals."
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
And anyway, so he said, "Well, you've read enough books, so why don't you go?" And I've been, and so I went. So at the age of 25, I found myself at Bradford College, Bradford and Ilkley Community College, wanting to be a teacher in primary education, because there was a...
So tempted to sing Ilkley Moor Bar Tat at the moment.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's definitely one of my favourite songs from my childhood. I loved it.
Right. Yeah,
it's so gross. It's great. I love the worms eating bit. It really appealed to me as a kid. But anyway, you carry on the story. Sorry. Yeah.
So at Bradford, I'm toying with the idea of being a teacher in a primary school. I love the teaching practice, but I couldn't get on in the classroom. It was, and this is the perennial problem for primary school educationalists, is there's not that many men in inner city primary schools. I guess there still aren't.
You can count on one hand still.
Yeah. I tried it, but I found the atmosphere in the staff room completely alien. So I decided to change course, did a final degree in organisation studies, and then I used to drink in a pub called the Manville Arms in Bradford, where I met Professor Geoffrey Pearson, the late Professor Geoffrey Pearson, who was the reader in applied social studies at Bradford University at the time. And he just secured a grant of the grand sum of £24,000 to investigate the then new phenomena of young working class people in the north of England smoking brown powder heroin. Wow. So that's where I came into this game, 1980, during the miners' strike, 84.
Wow.
Yeah.
That was an interesting time. But again, I'm not going to poke that bear. We're not going.
Yeah. So that was my first entrance into the world of substance use disorder was in research, looking at research and ethnograph, qualitative research. So basically going out into the field and hanging about with them.
Right. Because particularly in that time, we really weren't aware of how significant that type of substance misuse was going to become.
No.
It's still relatively new. And in fact, in some ways, it was also quite middle class as well. It was sort of seen as okay. And it became a disaster, as we know, because opiates are a disaster. Misuse of opiates. Folks, if you listen to this, don't misuse opiates. It's never pretty.
No. So
you were doing research in sort of working class culture, because it would have been cheap as chips in those days.
Yeah, £5 for a bag of brown powder heroin that you could smoke on a Kit Kat wrapper. And if you didn't have any tolerance to heroin at that time, that £5 would probably last a couple of days. However, suddenly it only lasts one day, and then it's only lasting half a day, and then it's £5 becomes 10 becomes 20. And even though people, when they were smoking it, said, "I will never ever inject. That's not what I do. We're just smoking this stuff, just like you'd smoke marijuana, like you'd smoke cannabis off, knives, hot knives. So we're smoking this brown powder off kitchen foil, and but never going to inject." But then suddenly, a few months down the line, when your habit's now up to like £20-30 a day, and you can halve that by getting over your fear of injecting, then economic reasons tended to win the day, and we had wholesale shift across from smoking brown powder heroin to injecting it, mixing it with the citric acid because it's not meant for injecting. So vinegar or Jif lemon, pasta lemon, citric acid.
And so what was this period of time that you were doing this research and this work?
1980, the field work was done in 1984 and 85. were reported in 1986, and the first publication, Young People and Heroin in the North of England, Gower Press, 1987.
Right.
Yeah.
And what was the sort of conclusions at that point then? What were you
It was all, we had to be very careful at the time because our research from Bradford University, colleagues at Liverpool University, Howard Parker and Russell Newcomb, Keith Bax, colleagues in Glasgow, and others, all reported at a similar time because the common denominator was the role of unemployment.
Right.
So the vast majority of young, working class heroin, and then by then addicts, in inverted commas, the common denominator for 90%, they were unemployed. And that was a politically difficult message to deliver. So we all reported in the similar time. Not a popular message politically, but absolutely true.
Yeah. And what was the link? Just to make it really simple.
Yeah. So basically,
young people turning to this. What was?
Yeah. So if you're unemployed, the days can be very long and boring. But if you've got a heroin habit, and you can't lie in bed and watch daytime television, you will be driven from your bed by morning thoughts. You will need to get up, get some money, buy something, or get something to sell, to get the money, to get the gear, to sort yourself out physically, because you're now physically dependent. And the first thing that struck me, even though I'd been, when I wasn't naive, I remember a lot of other people from an academic persuasion assuming that heroin addicts, in inverted commas, that they were retreating from life, that life was all too much for them, and that they were choosing to retreat into the warm arms of Lady Morphia and leave the travails of the world behind. So the first thing that struck me ethnographically, i.e. the way people behave, they look very busy.
Yeah.
Very, very busy. This looks a busy lifestyle. It's a full-time job.
Because if you haven't got a lot of money, you've got to earn the money to get the drug. Right?
Yeah.
If you're wealthy, you might retreat into some sort of, I don't know, open den or something like that.
Yeah.
You're Mr. Tarzan who inherited however much that bloke apparently inherited from.
Yeah.
But I guess if you're poor, you're not. You're going to have to be out robbing and doing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We had a seminal moment. We were looking around for the literature, doing the literature review, and came across a fantastic paper called Taking Care of Business, The Heroin User's Life on the Street.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Preble and Casey, 1969. You can Google it at your leisure. Yeah. And that's what, that was absolutely, that was the eureka moment. Yeah. This is what we're seeing. This is a busy lifestyle. And then when these people then made their way into treatment, because then after the research, so that was the research, and my next job was with Lifeline, which was drug advice and treatment service in the centre of Manchester. So those people then that we'd been doing the research on were now coming into treatment. And when they were detoxified and they were off heroin, the first thing that they had to grapple with is this time again. So what do we do with all this time?
Yeah.
And that prompted lots and lots of relapses. Just the sheer, there's far too much time.
Yeah. I'm going to come back to a word you used in inverted commas.
A
word that's going to be as part of this dialogue, because when you and I decided on the themes for this conversation, this word dialogue, getting a conversation going between framings of addiction or substance misuse, and actually the choice of those words will say a lot about where the person's coming from if they choose or they choose the word substance misuse. So do you mind deconstructing those two words a little bit and what they mean in terms of how you've understood them professionally? You can take the whole of your profession of this one in terms of
So in terms of addiction, so for me, when I say addiction, I'm thinking all drugs. So alcohol, addiction to alcohol, addiction to any mind-altering chemical, basically. And for me, addiction is like the heaviest end of a continuum. where people are completely and utterly dependent on that drug or drugs, including alcohol being the most prominent one, and that they can't possibly imagine a way of existing without it. It's more important in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs or any other hierarchy of needs. It trumps everything. Then it's a primordial desire. No, it's more than it is. It's a fundamental drive to get that drug in order to exist. Whereas substance use or substance misuse or substance use disorder might just be people who've, as a result of their drug and alcohol or other drug use, are getting into problems. So problems at work, they might get done for drink driving or something. They might be having relationship problems. They might be spending too much money. They might not like the person they become when they're intoxicated, etc.
Is there a different framing in terms of the types of interventions you might expect along that continuum then? So so obviously again on a continuum of brief interventions for the people who are not addicts, if you like. There's a good evidence base that a brief intervention may well be enough. Some people just drift into problematic use as a result of life circumstances, so losing a job, relationship difficulties, pandemic, classic, drift into drinking more, using more drugs, and just need a wake-up call. Not just, but need a wake-up call to say, oh, hang on, steady, maybe a drink diary, keep a diary of how much you drink and how much you're using. And even that, I know it sounds a bit cliche and a bit banal, but sometimes just a reminder of how much you're actually drinking and using can be enough as a brief intervention. Yeah. And that would be different to, say, the type of thing that an addict might need then?
Yeah, absolutely.
What might an addict need in your experience?
So for an addict, it's basically trying to find a way to live either abstinence, either abstinence from the drug that's causing the most problems, or abstinence from all mind-altering chemicals, total abstinence. It's a fundamental shift in everything: biological, psychological, social, even spiritual. It's the full deal: bio, psycho, social, spiritual. Okay. So the full, all four elements of the whole need to be addressed for the addict.
And would you say, we don't really have a definitive answer to this, but I'm interested in your perspective. Is it inevitable if somebody uses that they'll become an addict, or is, because we're going to be talking about different interventions such as you described, the harm minimization or the abstinence-based approaches. I don't think of them as either or. I think of them as options and choices. Well, circumstances, but
for me, so when I worked at Lifeline, we very quickly. So 1 minute I'm doing not 1 minute. We had the research. I had their research experience, which lasted a couple of years. And then into Lifeline, where those very same people were coming for treatment. And the first treatment that seemed absolutely crucial was harm reduction. So keep them alive. So the other thing that happened as well, I should have said, is when they moved to injecting, but by now, this is like 1986, 1987, we have this thing now called HTLV3, HIV. Yeah. HIV, which, it's worth remembering, the injection drug users in the UK at the time thought, we don't need to worry about this, it's about gay men. And so
it's rife in the injecting community.
Absolutely, yeah. So we had to address that. So we had so harm reduction was the dominant philosophy for the first line response at Lifeline, and that's really where my kind of moral philosophical allegiance began. If I had to choose, if I had to plant my flag anywhere, then it was with harm reduction, and still is. If I was forced at gunpoint to, I only had one flag, I could only plant it somewhere, then I'd be behind the harm reduction flag, But obviously,
we're not doing that forcing tonight. It's fine.
No. So the dialogue. So so harm reduction, keep people alive, keep them out of prison, and keep them free of HIV and any other bloodborne virus.
Yeah, hepatitis C being the other really dangerous one.
Absolutely. Yeah.
There's no treatment for hepatitis C even now.
Right.
Whereas HIV, there is treatment for. I mean, it's like, yeah. So harm reduction means looking at risk factors, what's going to kill you first, reduce the risk of that happening. Like
absolutely.
And then abstinence would be you just can't use. Sorry, just don't use.
Yeah. So I always thought of it as a ladder. So like the hierarchy of harm. So at the top of the ladder would be, and I saw this on, people using lots of different drugs, including alcohol, lots of different depressant drugs. So opioids, benzodiazepines, alcohol, the opioids and the benzos by injection. By injection, often with, in some cases, with a 10 ml barrel, which is with a syringe, with a green needle, which looks like a offensive weapon when it's put together, and people who are injecting opioids and benzodiazepines and drinking alcohol are at very high risk of stopping breathing.
Yeah, because they're relaxing all their muscles.
Absolutely, yeah.
And you mix all these muscle relaxants together. Your heart is a muscle, your lungs are a muscle, etc., etc.
Yeah. So, and it might even be sharing that injection equipment as well. So the idea was that was the highest point of harm. Yeah. So when you've got people whatever point that's the highest, then the thing is to make the next necessary small achievable step down to the next rung. So that and that's where recovery, to introduce the word for the first time, that's for me now where recovery begins, is any step down that ladder away from the highest form of harm. Okay. And at the other end of the extreme, of the bottom rung of the ladder would be total abstinence.
Yeah. Okay. So recovery, this word recovery that you just introduced, there's multiple meanings of it, I guess, but do you want to just run us deconstruct some of those meanings as you have with substance misuse and addiction?
Yeah, so the word recovery, I mean, interesting though, we're just thinking before we started, as well, 2005, when I was with the National Treatment Agency, we had a Northwest...
it that way. So you do Lifeline, but then you move back into policy.
Yeah.
Is that when you go into National Treatment Agency after Lifeline?
Yeah, so from Lifeline, I stayed at Lifeline for 15 years.
Right.
And then on...
so you get some really seriously good... Not good, I mean, that's a dreadful word. You get some real experience of what it's like on the streets in using population and what works and what doesn't work in a practical way in terms of reduce harm or promote independence or abstinence or whatever it is. So hard graft, but you learn a lot, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
At the sharp end of the coal face, as it were.
Yeah.
But then you decide that you want to move more into policy again, or?
Well, basically what had happened, I'd been at Lifeline for 15 years, and then the Home Office started a thing called the Drug Prevention Advisory Service. Yeah. And because my background is criminology, academic criminology is because I also did a master's in criminology, and decided that was what I really wanted to be ideally. So I flirted with academia for a while. And then the Home Office were recruiting for the Drug Prevention Advisory Service. So I applied to start with them and started with them on April Fool's Day, 1999. And stayed there for 2 years with the Home Office, which I enjoyed a lot. And then in November 2001, started with the National Treatment Agency as the North East Regional Manager, and then went on to be the National Strategic Recovery Lead with the National Treatment Agency and Public Health England.
National Treatment Agency no longer exists. They got absorbed into Public Health England. But the National Treatment Agency was what? What was its remit? What was it doing practically?
Yeah. So the National Treatment Agency did 4 things. So basically, the job one for the National Treatment Agency was to get more people with substance use disorder into treatment. And the most of the people with substance use disorder back then in 2001 were people who used opiates. Almost all of them crack cocaine as well, but certainly opiates. So the idea was to get them into treatment. So reduce the waiting list. Job one, get rid of the waiting list, get them all into treatment. We used to joke, it's a bit like rawhide. Don't try to understand them, just tie them up and brand them. Head them up and move them out. Rawhide. So get them into treatment. So that's job one. Job two, once they're in treatment, keep them there for long in retention. So access, job one, access, get people into treatment. Right. Once they're there, keep them there, retention, retain them in treatment long enough for that treatment to have an evidence-based impact, which is 12 weeks or 90 days is required in treatment, a minimum of 12 weeks or 90 days for the treatment to have, whatever treatment it is, to have any impact. And then in due course, once they're settled, then the system needs movement in it. So when and where possible, ease people through and out of the treatment system so that there's new places becoming available. So get them in, keep them in, then get them out.
Okay. What were the sort of treatment options then? What were the was it all in the hospital somewhere or?
No. So most people, all they were probably polydrug users. They used more than one drug.
Yeah.
The drug that they would be most dependent upon would be the opioid. So probably brown powder street heroin.
Yeah.
Still brown powder street heroin. So the predominant treatment that would bring them into the predominant treatment option that would bring people in was opioid substitution treatment.
Yeah.
So methadone maintenance treatment primarily, maybe other kind of opioid replacement therapy. But
was that in a rehab, a residential rehab, or was that?
No, that's in community settings, community clinics, primary care settings, GPs.
It's basically where people were living and the services were there, and they're encouraged to come into these services and harm minimisation, changes, reduce the use, education, psych education, social groups, that type of thing. So Trafford Community Drug Team, which I used to manage, was a classic one. So we had a psychiatrist, a psychologist. We even had somebody for sexual abuse speciality, health promotion person. So the idea was that the problem drug user would have several elements to his or her ETO makeup. The problem would be have several factors to it, and therefore the community drug teams, as they were called, needed to reflect the different specialities that would be required to address that multifactorial problem. So psychiatry, psychology. Why community-based? Why not sort of stick people in residential hospital settings?
The idea primarily was to get well where you got sick.
Right.
Yeah. So we can't, the numbers were so great that if you looked at a city like, so Manchester, I'm from Manchester, so Manchester might then have had something like, from memory, 7,000 of a population of 400,000 people. There could be as many as 7,000 heroin addicts. Well, just do the arithmetic. They can't all go to residential rehabilitation. Even though there was significant investments at that time, it wouldn't have paid for all 7,000 to go for residential treatment. So if you looked at the cost per patient per year of an option like methadone maintenance treatment, you could get it down, not that it was all about cost, but nevertheless, you could get that treatment cost down to about £2,000 per patient per year. Yeah. So you could afford to get them all, theoretically, to get them all in. I mean, they never were all in at one time, but maybe 50%, 60% at any one time would be in contact with treatment through primarily opioid substitution treatment.
Yeah. And the opioid substitution was to reduce these other risks of the polysubstance, the street drugs, the crime that would come with it, etc. Yeah.
So crime reduction and public health. So public health and safety. So reduce the crime and reduce the transmission of HIV, particularly HIV, but other bloodborne viruses like hepatitis C as well. Yeah. So harm reduction, harm minimisation sat very nicely alongside a public health model. Yeah. And indeed, if anybody's interested, if you look at the history of the Merseyside experiment, where they started that under a guy called Dr. John Marks, Howard Seymour, John Ashton, who is still around now. John Ashton was then the regional director of public health, and they established a full Merseyside response based on harm reduction and public health. A policy of public health and safety.
Yeah. And so these were sustainable approaches, but also ones that were evidence-based. So
Absolutely.
Strong evidence about the positive outcomes and people's lives improving.
Yeah. So the crime reduction, for example, if you put if you had somebody who committed a crime for the sole purpose of buying heroin on, let's say, 200 out of 365 days, if you kept them in treatment using a drug like methadone for a year, then the crime days would reduce by half.
Wow.
So from 100 to 50 in year 1, in year 2 from 50 to 25, in year 3 to 12 and a half, and then so a massive crime reduction dividend.
Yeah, that's incredible. I hadn't realised it was that powerful.
Yeah.
Extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary results.
Yeah.
And I'm presuming you were getting similar results globally in terms of people getting back into the workforce, maybe not as radical as that, but getting back on with their lives, moving on, reforming relationships with their community because they were no longer preying upon their community. So the possibility of reforming relationships. So those global sort of indicators would begin to improve for them.
Yeah, well, this is where it gets very interesting now, because in practice, the evidence is overwhelmingly in favour of opioid substitution treatment. So methadone maintenance treatment, big evidence base. Buprenorphine, which is an alternative to methadone, as a maintenance option, as a similar evidence base. Diamorphine, giving heroin addicts heroin. Diamorphine is the technical term for heroin. Diamorphine being twice as strong as the clinical name for heroin. So if you give heroin addicts, in inverted commas, if you give them opioids, then you'll get a reduction in crime. You will get an improvement in public health gains like HIV. So if you look at Liverpool, it's astonishing, because you had a natural experiment where Liverpool adopted harm reduction from the get-go, really. And you could look at a city like, at the time, Edinburgh, that didn't. Now not directly comparable cities demographically, but not completely dissimilar either. Edinburgh had much higher rates of HIV. Liverpool, amongst drug-injecting population, Liverpool had minimal levels of HIV transmission amongst and within people who injected drugs. So it was probably the jewel in the crown of the public health response to injection drug use in the UK. And then, however, the idea was that they would then, as you say, go on to become law-abiding citizens and go to work and look after the families and children. And that didn't happen as quickly as we might have hoped. So basically, the term of recovery came in to basically try and encourage a more pro-social, not that the opioid substitution treatment modality was anti-social or anything, but the politics. There was a big political backlash at the time, because that was the public health model of harm reduction was very closely aligned to the Blair government, the new Labour government of Blair and Brown, and the Conservatives were in opposition. The Conservatives made a lot of political capital about people being parked on methadone, so derogatory terms about people on methadone, that they weren't going back to work. I have to apologise to anybody listening now, because I almost certainly, I did, say things like, because in America there'd been a paper called Methadone, Wine and Welfare. Because if you give a heroin addict methadone, the theory was they won't need to spend all the money on heroin because you're giving them methadone. So what do they do with the money? Maybe they could save it up and go to college, or maybe they could spend it on Thunderbird wine, which was methadone, and stay on welfare on benefits. So a critique of the US situation called Methadone, Wine and Welfare. And I started talking about, for which I apologise profusely now on reflection, methadone, booze, benzos, benefits, and Jeremy Kyle. the UK version of Methadone, Wine and Welfare.
Mm.
And being a stand-up comic at heart, I couldn't resist the comedic value. But I realise actually now, and I deeply regret that, because I now realise how offensive people found that. So I'd like to take this opportunity to apologise profusely.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, but there was this emergent critique then happened in terms of methadone maintenance, and the word maintenance suggests that that's all it wants to do. Of course, it wasn't all it wanted to do, and then this term recovery comes in, which is what did it mean? We have a change of government. What did recovery mean in that context?
It became total abstinence.
Right.
It became shorthand for total abstinence treatment. So no longer. So if people are on methadone, they should be coming off it. And then we had targets. Remember, everything had a target. So we had a target to get people into treatment, to reduce the waiting list by X in Y amount of time, to keep people to retain people in treatment for 12 weeks and 90 days. Mm. And then as recovery came in, to get people out quickly, and crucially, that people who provide the treatment would be measured on how many people they get out who do not come back. So actually, then you started to get, again, on reflection, having had a lot of time since the last year or so to take stock of where I'm going next, looking back, you could say there was a perverse incentive to get people, to push people. I'm not saying that anybody was, but I know that certainly contracts were won on how well providers performed on getting people out of treatment. So it's not inconceivable to imagine that people who probably weren't ready to leave treatment found themselves leaving, or being strongly encouraged to leave. Now, obviously, that'll be another episode to discuss that.
And were those people, in your experience, were they then going into the abstinence model? Were they going into recovery? Did they and they understood this?
Yeah, so if you look at Liverpool, I mean, there was a phenomenal growth in Narcotics Anonymous, for example, which is the 12-step fellowship, which is for drugs, narcotics. It's for all drugs. But a lot of the people who had their primary problem would have been with heroin, not exclusively, but a lot would. And if you look at the growth of Narcotics Anonymous around this time in cities like Liverpool, you can almost draw a graph showing that the number of meetings that go up, and to this day, have been sustained. So lots of benefits from that, from people going out. So Narcotics Anonymous grew. Alcoholics Anonymous grew as well, I guess. Although I'm not certain about that, but certainly we looked at the time at the growth of Narcotics Anonymous meetings around the globe. And there was a period around about 2010, 2011, 2012, where Narcotics Anonymous was growing in Merseyside as quick, or if not quicker, than anywhere else in the world at that time. So,
and was this solving the issue? If there was an issue of people in maintenance programs not globally sort of moving on, was this growth, or was there a measurable impact in terms of you could see people re-entering the labour market, sort of reinvigoration of communities, etc.?
I think certainly in terms of community regeneration and people, going back to work and becoming citizens, there certainly seems to be an impact there. I'm not sure that it was. I'm pretty certain that you could find evidence to show that. I think Professor David Best would be able to produce stuff that would show that people going into abstinence-based recovery in 12-step fellowships or elsewhere, smart recovery, for example, is just the evidence is as strong for smart recovery as it is for 12-step.
Well, it isn't. We've done the research in the UK, so when we talk about recovery, we're talking about those two models have evidence base around them, so smart and 12-step.
Yeah. One of the things, though, that, again, ethnographically, anthropologically, I noticed is that you still got the phenomenon where people would go to meetings and they still would manage. They wouldn't go to work. They'd be going to meetings every day. So okay, it's still a great. They're not committing crime, so from society perspective, it's great. They're not injecting drugs and showing injection equipment, so it's a result on an HIV front, public health front. But if you're not going to work because you're too busy going to meetings, not that that's a bad thing, but there's still no societal. Well, there's a societal payback because you're not committing crime or sharing injection equipment. Yeah. But I'm sure you'll be familiar with the phenomena of the people who spend all the time going to meetings.
So there wasn't a clear sense in which it solved a problem that might not have existed anyway, which was about becoming fully paid on member society. It was actually just creating it was creating a support network for people who were not necessarily progressing onwards, but were no longer in those antisocial habits. So they weren't thieving and robbing, but they were joining groups of people. I guess, though, there must be, from a public health perspective as well, looking at social cohesion, even if the cohesion is within the 12-step groups or the SMART groups, there must have been an improvement in people's quality of lives because of that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it sounds negative, but it's a critique as opposed to with a Q, as opposed to a criticism, an observation and a critique. But yeah, definitely people eventually going back to work and looking after the children, etc., etc., etc. It's an overwhelmingly positive thing. So they were like evolutionary observations and evolutionary hiccups, if you like. As people, because we were moving out of a period of. I remember one guy, great story. Telling me he had to explain to his family that he was giving up benefits to go to take a minimum wage job, and they were saying, "What on earth are you thinking about? Do you know how difficult it is to get full benefits like PIP? Do you know how hard you've had to work to get that? Why on earth are you giving it up? Because I need to. It might not be the financial right thing to do, but it's the morally right thing to do." Right. And now that guy, he must be 15 years clean and sober now. And I'm sure his children are doing great, and and there's many more like him, So it's in that sense, it's overwhelmingly positive.
Yeah. And the people who are going to these, are they abstinent? Are they still using medication to support their?
No, I think the majority were aiming for abstinence-based recovery. Yeah. Now, obviously, whether they choose to go to Narcotics Anonymous because their primary problem was heroin, for argument's sake. Did they choose to drink alcohol? In my experience, probably not. So they were, even though they'd opted they felt more at home in Narcotics Anonymous or in Smart Recovery with a primarily opioid problem, tended not to be embrace total abstinence, including alcohol. Conversely, people might go to AA and not use heroin, cocaine anonymous. Yeah, obviously.
Yeah, but you said you've sort of come back, as it were, to where you planted that flag in harm minimization. And what does that look like now? I guess your conceptualization around harm minimization isn't the same as what it was, but what now in terms of this dialogue and this progression?
Yeah, I think there was. A woman when I first started, there was a woman in the Department of Health, a senior civil servant called Dorothy Black, and she said something like this, and it always stuck with me. The British drug treatment field is marvellous in many ways. However, it does have the tendency to lurch from one treatment fad to another like a herd of Gadarene swine. And I think she's absolutely right.
It's not Baroness Black, is it?
No, Dorothy Black. I don't even know if she's still alive. So, but yeah. So, it's like this. Like we're on a continuum from harm reduction to recovery, but on that continuum, it's like a pendulum as well. It's a mixed metaphors, right? And the pendulum swings.
I get what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, the pendulum swings from harm reduction to recovery in some places and back again. And in different places, in different times, the pendulum will be swinging very heavily towards recovery, and for recovery, read abstinence-based recovery. And in other places, it will by necessity swing back towards harm reduction.
I suppose the issue I have about the recovery model is that it is really aimed, if you like, thinking about the person who needs that. And if treatment is around that, and it makes me wonder about, even within, say, recovery circles, for example, it's well known that you can't say to young people coming into 12-step, you've got to have a rock bottom, you've got to have a disastrous life before you get it. We're actually giving a message to those young people saying, well, you can learn from other people's experience. You don't need to go all the way down. Isn't that enough as it is? And say, if you think about something like young people in AA, which is a part of Alcoholics Anonymous, they talk about having a soft bottom rather than a rock bottom. Because they want to talk to young people. And actually, this is unofficial, but there isn't so amongst, they'll be talking about abstinence amongst alcohol, and they'll be talking about abstinence, but it's also, there's a lot of tolerance of people doing whatever they have to do to stabilize themselves, for example. I would say that's true. And it's also, I would say, my experience of Narcotics Anonymous is that there's much more tolerance of people who are on medication-based programs because they relapse too much and they find it difficult to stay. Is that the type of thing now you're talking about in terms of this dialogue that seems to be emerging? Because recovery doesn't talk to somebody who's at the beginning of something, for example. It only really talks to people who've had really awful things happen, and then they get, but it's not a preventative message. Right. So is that the sort of area now you're thinking in terms of? Yeah, well, if you take, so for example, if you look at the choice of medication for those people who are primarily heroin addicts, in inverted commas, one time it used to be methadone, a bit like chips with everything, methadone for everybody. Well, now we've got buprenorphine. In France, they've always used more buprenorphine than methadone. What's the difference? Well, one of the qualitative differences, and this is not having a go at methadone. Methadone's perfect, particularly for people with trauma, by the way. But for people who want to have a lighter cognitive effect, they want to retain more cognitive ability and emotional presence, then buprenorphine would be indicated. Now, buprenorphine's been around for a long time. As I say, it's the treatment of choice in France. It's just an historical accident that we went down the methadone route. But now you can get buprenorphine in long-acting depot formulations. So in other words, you can have an injection of buprenorphine, one injection that will last, subcutaneous injection under your skin, that will last for 28 days. Bosh. Go in, have the buprenorphine inserted in an injection subcutaneously. Bosh, that's you done for 28 days. That means that you don't need to worry about going to the chemist. You don't need to worry about anything else. You are covered. The buprenorphine will be deposited into your bloodstream very efficiently every 24 hours or every 12 hours, the bioavailability is. But you will have buprenorphine coursing through your bloodstream for 28 days. So you don't need to worry about it. You're not totally abstinent, but you will be in a much better position to embrace and start to think about the necessary behaviour changes. Right. From what's the state, And that's the point, I think, for me, because I think what recovery models, and I'm not even thinking about limiting that notion to AA or 12-step or SMART, but if you think when I think broadly about the idea of recovery, it's about this concept of trying to improve yourself and your life circumstances and working on that and developing skills. Moving forwards in your life, making proactive, pro-social decisions, like the gentleman you talked about. I'm not doing this because it's better than being on benefits. I'm doing this because it feels like the right thing to do for me as a fully paid up member of society. Now, that type of attitude, I think, is really, really important to inculcate, and you can find that more easily in these recovery approaches. But it may be that some people can't approach that. Because they don't identify or they need this extra support. And the other thing that I'd just conscious of time is that's really exciting for me now is psychedelic psychotherapy. Yeah.
And one of my concerns about some of the culture of abstinence-based approaches is, I had somebody say to me a few weeks ago, a long-standing member of a 12-step fellowship, who's a friend and remains a friend, despite this, what he said, if one of my sponsees was to engage in psychedelic psychotherapy, either MDMA, ketamine, ayahuasca, the plant medicines like DMT, etc., any of the psychedelic psychotherapies, he would, in my view, relapse. I think that's bollocks.
Yeah.
Use a clinical term, I think, and to actually, it's that really upsets me, because it's wrong. It's just wrong. Because there's very good evidence now for psychedelic psychotherapy, particularly for trauma.
Yeah. And before people mishear that, what Mark's talking about and what I'm talking about when I'm talking about that is microdosing psychedelics under medically controlled circumstances. That's really, and especially trained people who can do that. I'm not going to advocate people going off down to Camden Lock and finding a so-called guru who'll give you a bag of mushrooms. That's not what we're talking about here. And I mean, I agree with you. There's plenty of evidence now that, particularly around trauma and the treatment of trauma, that the use of psychedelics with an appropriately qualified therapist to then take you through. And I mean, I visited places where they map your brain activity while you're doing these types of therapies, and they can show literally in real time which bits of the brain are activated and why it's working. So we know that. And what these approaches do is they make a trusting, loving relationship available between the patient and the therapist around issues that are so toxic for the patient that in the past they've not been able to approach those issues without severe trauma reactions, severe depressive reactions, severe suicidal reactions. So when we're talking about this, folks need to be very cognizant of this is serious stuff, and don't go out and just eat a handful of mushrooms and think you're doing something. You're not doing something therapeutic. You're doing something stupid if you do that. But I agree with you, and I think that there needs to be this dialogue around where do the medical support come in with the psychological support, the professional support, and then the recovery peer-based support, and how does this dialogue happen? I've noted I think it was about 4 years ago, that one of the major treatment agencies in the US that uses the Minnesota model, which is abstinence-based, have now said that they're going to be using medical approaches as well. And so I agree with you. We need to move this conversation on. So is this now where you're planning to move into, these types of issues and areas?
Yeah. So I've taken some time out to take stock, and but I'm now ready to rejoin the fray. And I'm particularly keen around particularly things like I just talked about, the different medications that are available that can sit alongside within a recovery framework. So you could be on long-acting depot formulations of buprenorphine and be in recovery legitimately.
And it's I think one of the scandals of abstinence-based approaches, for example, is the messages that people with ADHD have, that you can't use your ADHD medication. It's scandalous to say that. Absolutely scandalous. It's scandalous to say to people you can't use your medication to manage your depression or your anxiety. Scandalous. And so I think it is necessary. Interestingly, if you read the literature from these organizations, they all say the same thing, that if a doctor suggests you use it. So but it's about shifting that culture, isn't it?
Absolutely.
The way where, like you say, where we don't have that pendulum swing. It's enough, thank you. It's been bipolar for too long. And have a rational conversation. We are out of time, I'm afraid, Mark. It's been really, really amazing to have you back on the show. Thanks for your honesty about the struggle around the pandemic. That will resonate with people. It's been shit.
It certainly has. And
it's good I'm really touched by the fact that you feel energized and ready to get back into the fray. I look forward to your next project and about it when you've defined what it is. But a conversation to be had tonight, and maybe we can get a few other people in and revisit it with people in the future. So you stay there. I'm going to say goodbye to everybody else out there, and see you all next week with a guest who I don't know who it is, but he'll be a guest and they'll be good. So come back next week. But for now, folks, thanks very much, and catch you all next week. Bye-bye.